My son handed me mortgage documents for a $520,000 house and said, "Dad, you've saved enough. Time to help your family." I said no. They sued me for $750,000. And the judge asked me exactly one question. I'm Wade Patterson, but everyone calls me Buddy. I'm 62 years old, and I spent 8 years in the Navy, followed by 38 years as a master plumber crawling through basements and fixing what other people broke while my son Preston sat playing video games and trading cryptocurrency. I thought I'd seen everything until the day I received a subpoena from my own flesh and blood. My Navy service taught me discipline, integrity, and how to solve problems methodically. 8 years on, destroyers and submarines showed me the value of precision and following protocols. When I mustered out at 26, I took those lessons into civilian life. Started as an apprentice plumber, worked my way up to master craftsman, then ran my own small contracting business for the last 15 years before retirement. I built a reputation for honest work and fair prices. When folks in Louisville needed their pipes fixed right the first time, they called Patterson Plumbing. I took pride in that. There's something satisfying about solving a problem that stumps other people, about using your hands and your brain to make something work again. It started on a humid Saturday afternoon in late July. I was driving my 2018 Ford F-250 down Brownsboro Road toward Prospect, one of those gated communities where the lawns looked like golf courses and the driveways were filled with cars that cost more than my first house. The GPS kept telling me to turn right, but every turn led to bigger houses and more expensive cars. I checked the address again on the invitation. 3 months ago, my son Preston was asking me for gas money because his cryptocurrency consulting firm wasn't generating revenue yet. Now he was inviting me to a housewarming party at what looked like a mansion. The invitation itself should have been a warning sign, thick cardstock with gold foil lettering. Preston and Carol Patterson request the pleasure of your company, like they were hosting some charity gala instead of showing off a house they somehow managed to buy. I pulled my truck up to the curb in front of 1247 Ashford Lane. It's a good truck, built for work, with some honest dents and scratches from 20 years of hauling tools and materials to job sites across Kentucky. The bed still had my toolbox bolted down, though I rarely needed it these days. Old habits. I parked right behind a brand new silver Tesla Model X that still had the temporary plates on it. The house loomed in front of me. Easily 4,000 square feet of brick and stone with more windows than I could count. The lawn was perfect, like something out of a magazine. No tire tracks, no worn patches where kids actually played. I'd barely turned off the engine when the front door swung open. It was Carol, my daughter-in-law. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She marched down the driveway in heels that looked like weapons, clicking sharply against the decorative pavement. "Buddy," she said before I even opened my door, "you cannot park that thing here." I stepped out and adjusted my navy ball cap, a habit from decades of checking my appearance before meeting customers. "Good to see you too, Carol. Happy housewarming." She grimaced, looking at my truck like it was leaking oil onto her pristine driveway. "Seriously, the neighbors are going to talk. Can you move it around the corner, maybe 2 blocks over? We have important guests coming." I looked at the Tesla, then back at the house that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 5 years combined. "Nice car. That yours?" Carol smoothed her designer dress, something that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "It is. Preston surprised me with it last week. We needed something reliable for our new lifestyle. Reliable is a 20-year-old Ford that's paid off, Carol. Reliable is having money in the bank, not on your driveway." I gestured toward the house. "Speaking of which, how exactly did you afford all this? Last time we talked, Preston was between consulting contracts." Carol crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing like a cat sizing up prey. "We're investing in our future, buddy. Preston has some very exciting ventures taking off, multiple revenue streams. You'd understand if you'd ever thought bigger than fixing toilets and unclogging drains." That stung, and she knew it. Fixing toilets and unclogging drains had put food on the table for 30 years. Being a plumber had paid for Preston's college degree at the University of Kentucky, which he'd apparently decided was beneath him. My work had bought this very woman the diamond engagement ring she was waving around while insulting me. "I spent 8 years serving my country and 38 years serving my community," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'm not ashamed of honest work." "Of course not," Carol said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But some of us have higher aspirations." I grabbed the bottle of Maker's Mark bourbon I'd brought as a housewarming gift. Good Kentucky bourbon, the kind you save for special occasions. "I'm not moving the truck," I said. "If your neighbors are offended by a vehicle that's done an honest day's work, then they're not the kind of people I care about impressing." I walked past her toward the front door, feeling her eyes burning into my back. She pulled out her phone, probably texting Preston that his embarrassing father had arrived and was already causing problems. Walking up that driveway felt like walking into a trap. I just didn't know yet how deep the pit was, or who had dug it. Inside, the house was cool and smelled of expensive candles and fresh paint. The foyer was 2 stories high with a chandelier that looked like it belonged in a hotel lobby rather than someone's home. People were milling about, holding wine glasses and making that hollow small talk you hear at corporate mixers. All surface, no substance. The floors were some kind of imported marble that probably cost more per square foot than most people make in a day. Everything was white and beige and cream, like they'd hired an interior designer who was afraid of actual color. It looked expensive, but it didn't look lived in. It looked like a showroom. I spotted Preston near the kitchen island, which was covered with what Carol had probably called charcuterie boards, but looked like fancy lunch meat to me. He was wearing a navy blazer over a graphic t-shirt, trying to pull off that casual but successful look you see in tech magazines. When he saw me, his smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he switched on his showman face. "Dad," he boomed, coming over to clap me on the shoulder. He didn't hug me, hadn't hugged me since he was maybe 12 years old. Instead, he performed this backslapping routine like I was a client he was trying to impress. "You made it. How was the drive?" "Not bad," I said, looking around the great room. "Quite a place you have here, son. 5 bedrooms for 3 people. That's a lot of house to maintain." Preston laughed loud enough for his friends to hear. Everything was for the audience with him these days. "We have a cleaning service, Dad, and a lawn crew. We're focusing our energy on growth, not maintenance. Work smarter, not harder, right?" He gestured toward the crowd. "Come on, grab a drink. Let me introduce you to some people." He steered me toward a group of men who were discussing something called NFTs and their golf handicaps. None of them looked like they'd done a day of physical work in their lives. Soft hands, perfect teeth, expensive watches. "This is my father," Preston announced like he was introducing a celebrity. He was a master plumber back in the day, built his own business from scratch. Real blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth stuff. The way he said it made me sound like a museum exhibit, something quaint and outdated that people might find amusing. One of the men, a guy with teeth so white they probably glowed in the dark, looked me up and down like he was appraising livestock. "Interesting," the man said with a condescending smile. "Must be nice to work with your hands. Very authentic. I pay a guy to fix my garbage disposal. Wouldn't know where to start with that kind of thing." They all chuckled like this was the height of wit. Preston laughed the hardest, and something cold settled in my stomach. This was my son, laughing at the work that had paid for his education, his food, his clothes for the first 18 years of his life. I stared at Mr. Perfect Teeth. "It's not complicated," I said evenly. "You just have to be willing to get your hands dirty. Amazing what you can accomplish when you actually work for it instead of just talking about it." The laughter died down fast. Preston cleared his throat and shot me a warning look. "Right. Well, Dad, why don't you go say hi to Lance? He's in the game room, down the hall, last door on the right." I could take a hint. I was being dismissed, sent away like a child who'd embarrassed the adults. But I was happy to go find my grandson. He was the only reason I'd come to this circus anyway. The game room was bigger than my entire living room back home. It had 3 different gaming consoles, a pool table that probably cost more than my truck, and a television mounted on the wall that was larger than some movie screens. But for all the expensive toys, the room felt empty somehow. I found Lance sitting on a leather couch that could have seated 8 people, holding a controller and staring at the massive screen. He's 8 years old with Preston's dark hair and his mother's sharp features. But he's got something neither of them have. Genuine warmth in his eyes. "Grandpa!" he yelled when he saw me, dropping the controller and running over to give me a real hug. The kind that makes your chest tight and reminds you why family matters. "Hey there, buddy," I said, squeezing him back. "This is some game room you've got here." "Yeah," Lance said, but his voice was flat. "Mom says I can't eat in here because the furniture is Italian leather, and I can't have friends over because they might break something." It's kind of boring, actually. My heart broke a little. Here was a kid surrounded by more toys and gadgets than most children could dream of, and he was bored and lonely. All this money spent on stuff, but no thought given to what an 8-year-old actually needed, which was permission to be a kid. "Want to show me how this game works?" I asked, settling onto the couch next to him. Lance's face lit up. "Really? You want to play?" "Sure do. But you'll have to teach this old sailor how it works." For the next hour, I let my grandson teach me about Minecraft and some racing game whose name I couldn't pronounce. It was the most real conversation I'd had since walking into this house. Lance chattered away about building virtual worlds and racing virtual cars, and I listened because that's what grandfathers do. But even as we played, I was thinking about the house around us, the expensive cars in the driveway, and the uncomfortable question that had been nagging at me since I'd received the invitation. How exactly had my unemployed son managed to afford all this? Eventually, Carol appeared in the doorway of the game room, dressed in what looked like a cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Dinner's served," she announced, her voice carrying that fake cheeriness that people use when they're trying to control a situation. "And Lance, sweetie, go wash your hands, twice. We have cloth napkins tonight, and we don't want any accidents." She looked directly at me when she said accidents, like she expected me to spill something or break their precious dinnerware. Lance's shoulders slumped a little, but he obediently headed off to wash his hands. I followed. Carol back toward the dining room, noticing how she walked, like she was on a stage performing for an invisible audience. The dining room was a monument to excess, a table that could seat 12 people, though there were only 8 of us for dinner. Crystal glasses that caught the light from yet another chandelier, china plates that looked like they belonged in a museum, everything designed to impress rather than to actually use. Preston was playing host, filling wine glasses and making sure everyone felt important. I recognized the performance. It was the same act he'd put on as a kid when he wanted something, all charm and attention until he got what he was after. "Dad, you sit here," Preston said, gesturing to a chair at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation. Another subtle dismissal. The meal was a production. Steaks that were cooked more for appearance than taste, served on plates that were too small and too fancy. Wine that probably cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a month. The conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to: vacation homes in Aspen, private school admissions, investment portfolios. I sat there eating quietly, doing what I'd learned to do in the Navy and later on job sites: observe and listen. You learn a lot about people when you pay attention to what they don't say as much as what they do. And what I noticed was that Preston was scared. His hands had a slight tremor every time he reached for his wine glass. He was sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning. When someone asked him about his consulting business, his answers were vague and rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in front of a mirror. Carol, on the other hand, was in her element. She dominated the conversation, name-dropping restaurants and designers and vacation destinations like she was reading from a lifestyle magazine. But I noticed she never mentioned what she actually did for work or where the money was coming from to fund all this luxury. "So, buddy," said one of the guests, "a woman with jewelry that probably cost more than my truck. Preston tells us you're retired. That must be nice, having all that time on your hands." "It has its advantages," I said carefully, "though I stay busy. Still do some consulting work for contractors who need troubleshooting on complex jobs." "How quaint," the woman said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's wonderful that you're still useful." Preston laughed a little too loud at that, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just casual rudeness. This was deliberate. They were softening me up for something. When the dessert course was being served, some elaborate creation that looked more like art than food, Preston stood up and tapped his wine glass with a spoon. "Everyone," he said, his voice carrying that false confidence I'd heard before when he was trying to sell something. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate our new home. Carol and I feel so blessed to be surrounded by such wonderful friends." The guests murmured their approval, raising their glasses in a toast. But before we continue the evening, Preston continued, I'd like to have a private moment with my father. Dad, would you mind joining me in the study? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. The way he said it made my skin crawl, too formal, too prepared. This wasn't a casual father-son conversation. This was an ambush. The other guests smiled and nodded like this was perfectly normal, but I caught the look that passed between Carol and Preston. She gave him a tiny nod like a director cueing an actor. Of course, I said, standing up. Lead the way. Preston's study was clearly designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with books that looked like they'd never been opened, a massive mahogany desk that belonged in a law firm, leather furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. Preston walked around behind the desk and sat down, gesturing for me to take the chair across from him. Carol followed us in and closed the door behind her, then positioned herself near the door like a sentry. The setup was all wrong. This wasn't how family talked to each other. This was how business rivals negotiated or how lawyers interrogated witnesses. So, Dad, Preston said, trying to project an air of authority from behind that oversized desk. What do you think of the place? It's impressive, I said honestly. But I'm going to ask you one more time. How exactly did you afford all this? The house, the cars, the furniture. 6 months ago, you were asking me for help with your electric bill. Preston waved his hand dismissively, like my question was unreasonable. I told you the consulting firm is taking off. We're projecting significant revenue growth over the next 2 quarters. Projecting, I repeated. So you don't actually have the money yet. That's not how modern business works, Dad, Carol interjected, pushing off from the door and walking toward us. You leverage future earnings to invest in current opportunities. It's about having vision. She placed a thick manila folder on the desk between Preston and me. It landed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo in the room. What's this? I asked, though something in my gut already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Open it, Preston said, his voice trying to sound casual but carrying an undertone of nervousness that reminded me of when he was 10 years old and had broken something expensive. I flipped open the manila folder and my blood pressure spiked. It wasn't a business proposal or family photos. It was a mortgage application. Thick, official, and already partially filled out. I scanned the pages, my eyes catching on key details that made my stomach drop. Purchase price, $520,000. Loan amount, $415,000. Interest rate, 6.75% adjustable. But what made my hands start to shake was the section labeled co-borrower, typed neatly in, typed. That box, in official-looking font, was my full name, Wade Eugene Patterson. I looked up at Preston, who was watching me with the intensity of a poker player waiting to see if his bluff would work. Carol had moved closer, positioning herself where she could see my reaction. I never agreed to this, I said, my voice low and dangerous in a way that would have made my old Navy shipmates step back. We know, Dad, Preston said quickly, his words tumbling out like he'd rehearsed them. That's exactly why we're having this conversation. The bank requires a co-signer for the final approval. My credit took a hit during the transition period between business ventures, and Carol's student loan debt is affecting our debt-to-income ratio. I flipped through more pages, finding details that made me feel sick. This wasn't just about co-signing. There was a down payment listed, 20% of the purchase price, $104,000, listed under source of funds, gift from father. I closed the folder and set it on the desk like it was contaminated. No, I said simply. Carol stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the back of my chair. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not co-signing a $415,000 mortgage for a house you clearly can't afford, and I'm sure as hell not giving you $104,000 as a gift. Preston shot up from his chair, his composure finally cracking. Dad, you have the money. I know exactly how much you have. You sold the rental properties in Tennessee for $380,000 last year. You've got your Navy pension, your Social Security, Mom's life insurance money that's just sitting in CDs, earning nothing. The fact that he knew my financial situation in such detail sent alarm bells ringing in my head. That's my retirement money, Preston. I worked for 46 years total, 8 in the Navy and 38 as a plumber, for that security. That money is for my health care, for emergencies, for making sure I don't become a burden on anyone when I'm too old to take care of myself. It's for family, Carol hissed, leaning over my chair now, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with wine. You're being selfish, Wade. You're an old man rattling around alone in a paid-off house. What are you going to do with all that money? Take it to the grave? Her words hit like a slap, but I'd heard worse from tougher people. I'm going to live on it, I said evenly. That's what retirement savings are for. If you really cared about Lance, Preston said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone I remembered from his teenage years, you'd want him to grow up in a safe neighborhood. You'd want him to have opportunities, to go to good schools, to have advantages. I stood up, meeting his eyes across that ridiculous desk. Don't you dare bring Lance into this manipulation. If you cared about Lance, you'd live within your means and teach him the value of honest work. Honest work? Carol laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's rich coming from someone who spent his life crawling under houses and fixing toilets. The insult hung in the air like smoke. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, to show some respect for the work that had paid for his food, his clothes, his education. Instead, he looked at the floor. Preston, I said quietly, tell me the truth. You've already closed on this house, haven't you? His silence was answer enough. You signed a purchase agreement without having the money, I continued. You put down earnest money you didn't have. You're in a bridge loan situation, and if you don't get permanent financing, you lose everything. Preston's face went pale. We closed 10 days ago, he whispered. The bridge loan expires in 48 hours. Dad, if we don't get this mortgage approved with your co-signature and down payment, we lose the house. We lose the $25,000 earnest money. We lose everything. The full scope of their stupidity hit me like a cold wave. So you bought a $500,000 house you couldn't afford, gambling that I'd bail you out. We thought you'd want to help your family, Preston shouted, his mask finally slipping completely. We thought you'd want to be a father instead of a miser. I reached for the glass of red wine Preston had poured for me earlier, a 2019 Cabernet that probably cost $80 a bottle. I held it up, looking at the deep red liquid, then at the pristine white Persian rug beneath my feet. I am a father, I said quietly. And being a father means teaching your children that actions have consequences. I tipped the glass. The wine poured out in a steady stream, splashing onto the white rug and spreading like blood. The stain would never come out. Carol screamed like I'd shot someone. Are you insane? That's a $15,000 rug! I set the empty glass on the mahogany desk with deliberate care. I'd rather pour my money down a drain than give it to people who think they're entitled to my life's work. I turned toward the door, but Carol's voice stopped me cold. If you walk out that door, Wade, you'll never see Lance again. The room went dead silent. Even the party noise from the rest of the house seemed to fade away. I turned around slowly. Carol was smiling, but it was the ugliest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. You heard me, she continued. We're his parents. We control access. If you're not going to be part of this family's financial future, then you're not going to be part of this family at all. The silence that followed Carol's threat was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the blood rushing in my ears. In the distance, the party continued. Laughter and conversation from people who had no idea that my world was being torn apart in this room. I looked at Preston, waiting for him to speak up, to defend me, to tell his wife that using his son as a weapon against his father was wrong, but he just stood there behind that massive desk, looking at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. That silence told me everything I needed to know. My son, the boy I'd taught to fish, to drive, to tie his shoes, was willing to let his wife use my grandson as blackmail. The last thread of sympathy I'd been clinging to snapped like an overstressed cable. I looked at Carol, and when I spoke, my voice carried the calm authority I'd learned commanding men in engine rooms where a mistake could kill everyone aboard. You think you're holding all the cards, I said, but you have no idea who you're playing against. Carol's smile widened. She thought she'd won. Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A lonely old man who's too proud to admit he needs family more than they need him. I walked to the door and put my hand on the brass handle. Don't expect me at Thanksgiving, I said without looking back. I walked out of that study, through the great room where the guests were still chatting and laughing, past the expensive furniture and artwork, and out the front door. I got into my F-250 and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Preston watching from the window of his study. He looked terrified. Good. He should be terrified because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I drove home through the dark Louisville streets, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The threat about Lance echoed in my head like a broken record. They thought they could break me with that ultimatum. They thought I'd come crawling back within a week, checkbook in hand, begging to be let back into my grandson's life. They'd seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I didn't go home to feel sorry for myself. I went home to prepare for war. My house on Bardstown Road isn't much to look at from the outside. A modest 1970s ranch that I'd bought 30 years ago and paid off 15 years early. But it was mine, free and clear, and every improvement had been done with my own hands. New roof, updated electrical, refinished hardwood floors, renovated kitchen. It might not have impressed Carol's fancy friends, but it was solid, functional, and built to last. I went straight to my home office, a small room off the kitchen that I'd converted from a bedroom when my wife Sarah died 8 years ago. The walls were lined with filing cabinets containing 40 years of financial records, tax returns, insurance documents, and business correspondence. I kept everything organized and documented, a habit from my Navy days where proper record-keeping could mean the difference between life and death. I unlocked the fireproof filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out my financial portfolio. Preston was right about one thing. I did have money. I'd been careful with every dollar for decades, investing in rental properties when real estate was cheap, putting maximum amounts into my 401k, living below my means while other people bought boats and fancy cars they couldn't afford. The numbers were impressive, even to me. Between the property sales, my pension, Social Security, and Sarah's life insurance, I was worth just over $1.2 million. Not enough to be truly wealthy, but more than enough for a comfortable retirement if I was smart about it. But I also pulled out something else, a credit monitoring report I'd received 3 days ago and hadn't paid much attention to. It showed an unexplained drop in my credit score, a significant drop that didn't make sense given my payment history. I sat down at my computer and logged into my credit monitoring service. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 new credit cards had been opened in my name over the past 3 months. One from American Express, one from Chase, one from Citibank. The total balance across all 3 cards was already $42,000, and every single purchase had been made in the Louisville area. The billing address for all 3 cards was 2247 Ashford Lane, the mansion I'd just left. My hands stopped shaking. A cold, analytical calm settled over me. The same feeling I'd had during emergency drills in the Navy when alarms were blaring and everyone else was panicking. Preston and Carol hadn't just asked me for money tonight. They'd been stealing from me for months. I pulled up the detailed statements online. The purchases read like a catalog of excess: $8,000 at a furniture store, $5,000 at Best Buy, $3,000 at Nordstrom, $1,200 for a single dinner at some pretentious restaurant downtown. They'd been furnishing their new lifestyle with my credit, my good name, my decades of financial responsibility. Preston had my Social Security number. I'd given it to him 6 months ago when he helped me navigate the Medicare supplement enrollment website. I'd thanked him for helping his old dad with the confusing paperwork. The whole time, he'd been photographing my personal information. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Preston. I didn't call Carol. I called the fraud department of American Express. "This is Wade Patterson," I told the representative who answered. "I need to report identity theft. I'll be happy to help you with that, Mr. Patterson. Do you know who might have had access to your personal information?" I looked at the photo on my desk, a picture of me and Preston from last Christmas, both of us smiling, him with his arm around my shoulders like we were best friends. I turned the photo face down. "Yes," I said, "the suspect is my son." I spent the next 4 hours on the phone with credit card companies, credit bureaus, and fraud departments. I froze every account, disputed every charge, and locked down my credit tighter than a submarine's hull. By the time I was finished, it was 3 a.m., and every fraudulent card Preston and Carol had been using was now useless plastic. I poured myself 3 fingers of Maker's Mark and sat in my recliner in the dark. I knew what would happen next. When those cards started getting declined, when the bridge loan came due, when reality finally caught up with their fantasy lifestyle, they'd come for me again. But this time they'd come with lawyers. Let them come. I was ready. The silence that followed Carol's threat was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the blood rushing in my ears. In the distance, the party continued, laughter and conversation from people who had no idea that my world was being torn apart in this room. I looked at Preston, waiting for him to speak up, to defend me, to tell his wife that using his son as a weapon against his father was wrong. But he just stood there behind that massive desk, looking at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. That silence told me everything I needed to know. My son, the boy I'd taught to fish, to drive, to tie his shoes, was willing to let his wife use my grandson as blackmail. The last thread of sympathy I'd been clinging to snapped like an overstressed cable. I looked at Carol, and when I spoke, my voice carried the calm authority I'd learned commanding men in engine rooms where a mistake could kill everyone aboard. "You think you're holding all the cards," I said, "but you have no idea who you're playing against." Carol's smile widened. She thought she'd won. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A lonely old man who's too proud to admit he needs family more than they need him." I walked to the door and put my hand on the brass handle. "Don't expect me at Thanksgiving," I said without looking back. I walked out of that study, through the great room where the guests were still chatting and laughing, past the expensive furniture and artwork, and out the front door. I got into my F-250 and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Preston watching from the window of his study. He looked terrified. Good. He should be terrified, because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I drove home through the dark Louisville streets, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The threat about Lance echoed in my head like a broken record. They thought they could break me with that ultimatum. They thought I'd come crawling back within a week, checkbook in hand, begging to be let back into my grandson's life. They'd seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I didn't go home to feel sorry for myself. I went home to prepare for war. My house on Bardstown Road isn't much to look at from the outside. A modest 1970s ranch that I'd bought 30 years ago and paid off 15 years early. But it was mine, free and clear, and every improvement had been done with my own hands. New roof, updated electrical, refinished hardwood floors, renovated kitchen. It might not have impressed Carol's fancy friends, but it was solid, functional, and built to last. I went straight to my home office, a small room off the kitchen that I'd converted from a bedroom when my wife Sarah died 8 years ago. The walls were lined with filing cabinets containing 40 years of financial records, tax returns, insurance documents, and business correspondence. I kept everything organized and documented, a habit from my Navy days where proper record-keeping could mean the difference between life and death. I unlocked the fireproof filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out my financial portfolio. Preston was right about one thing. I did have money. I'd been careful with every dollar for decades, investing in rental properties when real estate was cheap, putting maximum amounts into my 401k, living below my means while other people bought boats and fancy cars they couldn't afford. The numbers were impressive, even to me. Between the property sales, my pension, Social Security, and Sarah's life insurance, I was worth just over $1.2 million. Not enough to be truly wealthy, but more than enough for a comfortable retirement if I was smart about it. But I also pulled out something else, a credit monitoring report I'd received 3 days ago and hadn't paid much attention to. It showed an unexplained drop in my credit score, a significant drop that didn't make sense given my payment history. I sat down at my computer and logged into my credit monitoring service. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 new credit cards had been opened in my name over the past 3 months. One from American Express, one from Chase, one from Citibank. The total balance across all 3 cards was already $42,000, and every single purchase had been made in the Louisville area. The billing address for all 3 cards was 1247 Ashford Lane, the mansion I'd just left. My hands stopped shaking. A cold, analytical calm settled over me, the same feeling I'd had during emergency drills in the Navy when alarms were blaring and everyone else was panicking. Preston and Carol hadn't just asked me for money tonight. They'd been stealing from me for months. I pulled up the detailed statements online. The purchases read like a catalog of excess. $8,000 at a furniture store, $5,000 at Best Buy, $3,000 at Nordstrom, down $200 for a single dinner at some pretentious restaurant downtown. They'd been furnishing their new lifestyle with my credit, my good name, my decades of financial responsibility. Preston had my social security number. I'd given it to him 6 months ago when he helped me navigate the Medicare supplement enrollment website. I'd thanked him for helping his old dad with the confusing paperwork. The whole time, he'd been photographing my personal information. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Preston. I didn't call Carol. I called the fraud department of American Express. "This is Wade Patterson," I told the representative who answered. "I need to report identity theft. I'll be happy to help you with that, Mr. Patterson. Do you know who might have had access to your personal information?" I looked at the photo on my desk, a picture of me and Preston from last Christmas, both of us smiling, him with his arm around my shoulders like we were best friends. I turned the photo face down. "Yes," I said. "The suspect is my son." I spent the next 4 hours on the phone with credit card companies, credit bureaus, and fraud departments. I froze every account, disputed every charge, and locked down my credit tighter than a submarine's hull. By the time I was finished, it was 3 a.m., and every fraudulent card Preston and Carol had been using was now useless plastic. I poured myself 3 fingers of Maker's Mark and sat in my recliner in the dark. I knew what would happen next. When those cards started getting declined, when the bridge loan came due, when reality finally caught up with their fantasy lifestyle, they'd come for me again. But this time, they'd come with lawyers. Let them come. I was ready. 3 days passed in an eerie calm, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. I kept to my normal routine: morning coffee, reading the Courier-Journal, working in my garage on small repair projects that kept my hands busy while my mind processed what was coming. But underneath the ordinary surface, everything had changed. The silence from Preston and Carol was deafening. No more phone calls, no texts, no surprise visits. They'd either figured out that their credit card scheme was blown and were regrouping, or they were so busy dealing with the immediate crisis of their bridge loan coming due that they hadn't had time to plan their next move. I was betting on the latter. On Thursday morning, I decided to test my theory. I drove past Whitfield Academy during pickup time, parking across the street where I could observe without violating any restraining orders that might be in the works. Sure enough, I didn't see the Tesla or any other expensive car that might belong to Preston and Carol. Instead, a beat-up Honda Civic with temporary plates pulled up to collect Lance. The driver was a woman I didn't recognize, probably a friend or relative doing them a favor. Lance looked smaller than usual as he climbed into the back seat, his backpack dragging on the ground. Even from a distance, I could see that something was wrong. That afternoon, I got my first piece of confirmation that my counterattack was working. My neighbor, Betty Williams, knocked on my door with a casserole and the latest neighborhood gossip. "Buddy," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the comfort of someone who'd been bringing me food since Sarah died, "I heard the strangest thing at the grocery store. Martha Henderson was behind me in line, and she was talking about some young couple in Prospect who got their house seized by the bank. Happened overnight," she said. "Sheriff's deputies and everything." I kept my expression neutral while cutting into Betty's tuna casserole. "That's unfortunate. This economy's been hard on a lot of folks. Martha said it was some kind of fraud situation. The couple had been living in this mansion for less than 2 weeks before the bank came and padlocked the doors. Can you imagine? All their belongings still inside, nowhere to go." I made appropriate sympathetic noises while my heart rate stayed perfectly steady. The bridge loan had come due, and without my co-signature or the fraudulent credit cards to make payments, Preston and Carol's house of cards had collapsed exactly as I'd predicted. "The really sad part," Betty continued, "is they had a little boy. 8 years old," Martha said. "Had to watch his parents get evicted from what he thought was his new home. That hit me harder than I'd expected. Whatever I thought about Preston and Carol, Lance was innocent in all this. He was just a kid who'd been yanked from one crisis to another because his parents couldn't live within their means." Friday brought the next escalation. I was replacing a faucet in my guest bathroom when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I saw a sheriff's deputy getting out of his cruiser. He was carrying a manila envelope that I recognized all too well. I answered the door before he could knock. "Wade Patterson?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. "That's me." He handed me the envelope with the same professional courtesy I'd seen dozens of times in my plumbing business. "You've been served, sir. Have a good day." I didn't wait for him to leave before I tore open the envelope. Inside was exactly what I'd been expecting: a lawsuit. The header read Patterson v. Patterson with Preston, and Carol listed as plaintiffs and me as the defendant. They were suing me for $750,000. I scanned the legal language, picking out the key accusations. Breach of oral contract. They claimed I'd promised them the down payment money at a family barbecue last year. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Apparently, my refusal to fund their lifestyle had caused Carol severe psychological trauma. Promissory estoppel, a fancy legal term that basically meant they'd relied on my alleged promise to their detriment. The most infuriating part was the section describing my malicious and calculated behavior at their housewarming party. According to their version of events, I'd deliberately destroyed their property and verbally abused them in front of their guests, causing irreparable damage to their reputation and social standing. They painted me as a wealthy, vindictive old man who got pleasure from crushing his own family's dreams. Reading their description of me was like looking in a funhouse mirror, technically recognizable but distorted beyond reality. I called Susan Rodriguez immediately. They filed, I told her when she picked up. I figured they would. How bad is it? $750,000. They're claiming I promised them money and then maliciously withdrew the offer. Can you prove you never made such a promise? I thought about that barbecue they'd mentioned. It was the 4th of July last year, and I remembered the conversation clearly. Preston had been talking about wanting to buy a house someday, and I'd said something about helping with closing costs when the time came. Closing costs, not a down payment. Maybe $5,000, not $104,000. I can prove what I actually said versus what they're claiming, I told Susan. Good. Can you be in my office Monday morning at 8 a.m.? We need to craft our response, and I want to discuss a countersuit. Countersuit? Susan's voice carried a cold satisfaction that reminded me why I'd hired her. Buddy, they just opened the door for us to attack them on multiple fronts. If they want to claim you damaged their reputation, we're going to show the court exactly what their reputation is actually worth. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the lawsuit papers spread across the table. 46 years of work, 8 years of military service, a lifetime of building a reputation for honesty and reliability, and my own son was trying to destroy it all for money. But as I read through their accusations again, I realized they'd made a critical mistake. In their desperation to make me look like the villain, they'd sworn under oath to a version of events that I could prove was false. They'd just handed me the rope I'd need to hang them. I poured myself a bourbon and raised the glass in a mock toast to the empty kitchen. Here's to family, I said, and drained it in one swallow. Monday morning came gray and cold, with the kind of October chill that reminded you winter was coming whether you were ready or not. I was at Susan Rodriguez's office by 7:45 a.m., carrying a banker's box full of documents I'd spent the weekend organizing. Susan's conference room had been transformed into what she called a war room. Legal pads covered the table, file boxes were stacked against the walls, and a whiteboard displayed a timeline of events that looked like something from a police investigation. "Show me what you've got," Susan said, gesturing to my box. I laid out my evidence methodically. The original barbecue invitation from last July where Preston had mentioned house hunting, my credit monitoring reports showing the exact dates the fraudulent accounts were opened, bank statements proving I was in Atlanta when key purchases were made, and receipts from the plumbing trade show that provided my alibi. But the most important document was something I'd found buried in my files over the weekend. A promissory note from 2018 when Preston had borrowed $15,000 from me to start his first failed business venture. He'd signed it, dated it, and promised to pay me back with interest. He'd made exactly 2 payments before defaulting. "This is gold," Susan said, holding up the promissory note. "It establishes a pattern of financial irresponsibility and shows he has a history of not honoring his obligations to you." "There's more," I said, pulling out a manila folder I'd been saving for last. "I hired a private investigator." Susan's eyebrows went up. "When?" "Saturday. Called a guy named Bennett who used to be a cop. He specializes in financial investigations." I spread Bennett's preliminary report across the table. It was a roadmap of Preston and Carol's financial disasters, bank statements showing massive gambling losses on crypto trades, credit reports revealing defaults, and collections, records showing Carol had filed bankruptcy in Tennessee under her maiden name 3 years ago. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a specific entry. Preston lost $23,000 in cryptocurrency in March alone. Carol has been rotating credit card debt for 2 years, using cash advances from one card to make minimum payments on others. They're not entrepreneurs. They're addicts. Susan read through the financial records with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining x-rays. This explains how they qualified for the bridge loan. They probably used the fraudulent credit cards to make it look like they had cash reserves. Bennett's still digging, I said. He thinks there might be other victims. Landlords, creditors, maybe even Carol's parents. Good. The more evidence we have of their pattern of fraud, the stronger our position. Susan made notes on her legal pad. Now let's talk about their lawsuit. They're claiming you promised them money at a family gathering. Do you remember the conversation? I nodded. 4th of July last year. We were on my back deck grilling burgers. Preston was talking about wanting to buy a house someday, how expensive everything was getting. I told him when he was ready to make a serious purchase, I'd help with closing costs. Closing costs. Not a down payment. Maybe $3,000 to $5,000, not $104,000. Were there witnesses? Carol was there, but she's not exactly an objective witness at this point. My neighbor, Betty Williams, might have overheard part of it. She was in her backyard gardening. Susan made another note. We'll interview her. What about the housewarming party? Their version makes you sound like you went there specifically to humiliate them. I went there to see my grandson and to figure out how they could afford a $500,000 house on no income. I described the evening in detail, the condescending guests, Preston's obvious nervousness, the mortgage documents with my forged information. The wine incident? Susan asked. They ambushed me with loan documents and demanded I co-sign and provide $104,000. When I refused, Carol threatened to cut off my access to Lance. I poured out my wine on their carpet and left. Childish maybe, but hardly the violent and threatening behavior they're alleging. Susan closed the file. Buddy, I think we can not only defend against their lawsuit but destroy them with our countersuit. What are you thinking? Susan walked to the whiteboard and started writing. Fraud, defamation, elder abuse, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We'll turn their own claims against them. And here's the beautiful part. By filing this lawsuit, they've opened themselves up to discovery. We can subpoena every financial record, every email, every text message they've sent in the past 2 years. I felt a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. How long will this take? 6 months, maybe 8 if they drag their feet. But buddy, I have to warn you, this is going to get ugly. They're going to attack your character, your mental competency, your relationship with your grandson. They'll try to paint you as a bitter old man who's lost touch with reality. Let them try, I said. I've got 46 years of honest work and military service backing me up. What do they have? Debt and desperation, Susan said, which can make people dangerous. That afternoon, I drove past the old house on Ashford Lane where Preston and Carol had briefly lived their fantasy. The windows were boarded up, and a large sign in the front yard read, "Property of First National Bank, no trespassing." The perfect lawn was already starting to look ragged around the edges. I thought about Lance, probably confused and scared, moving from one temporary living situation to another while his parents dealt with the consequences of their choices. I thought about the trust fund I was going to establish for him, money that would be protected from his parents' recklessness until he was old enough to use it wisely. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Preston. Dad, we need to talk. This has gone too far. Can we meet somewhere neutral? I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. There was nothing neutral about what they'd done to me, and there was nothing left to talk about. They'd made their choice when they decided to steal my identity and forge my signature. Now they'd have to live with the consequences. The war had begun, and I intended to win it. 4 months later, I walked into the Jefferson County Circuit Court wearing the same charcoal suit I'd worn to Sarah's funeral. It was the only suit I owned, and it still fit the same as it had 8 years ago. Susan Rodriguez walked beside me, carrying 2 briefcases and wearing the kind of expression that made opposing lawyers nervous. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old wood and the nervous sweat of people whose lives were about to be decided by strangers. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded, watching as Preston and Carol entered with their attorney, a man named Roy Walsh who specialized in personal injury cases and had probably never handled a family financial dispute in his life. Preston looked like he'd aged 5 years in 4 months. His expensive clothes had been replaced with a cheap suit that didn't fit properly. Carol looked gaunt, her designer wardrobe traded for a modest dress that screamed responsible mother to any jury that might be watching. They were playing their parts, but I could see the desperation underneath the performance. Judge Dean Crawford entered, a man in his mid-60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of human stupidity the legal system could produce. He settled into his chair and looked down at us with the expression of someone who was already tired of whatever nonsense was about to unfold. Case number 2023 CV 4729, Patterson versus Patterson, the clerk announced. Plaintiff seeking $750,000 in damages for breach of contract and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Walsh stood for his opening statement, and I had to admit he was good at his job. He painted a picture of a loving son and daughter-in-law who had relied on a father's promise, only to have that promise cruelly withdrawn out of spite. He described me as a bitter old man sitting on a fortune while my family struggled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh said, addressing the jury like they were his personal friends, "this isn't a complex case about business law or financial regulations. This is about a simple promise broken by a man who chose revenge over family love." When Susan stood for our opening, she was surgical in her precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is indeed about broken promises. But the promises that were broken were made by the plaintiffs. Promises to pay back loans, promises to live honestly, promises to treat family with respect, rather than as ATM machines." She walked to the evidence table and picked up a manila folder. "The evidence will show that Preston and Carol Patterson didn't just break promises to Mr. Patterson. They broke the law." The first witness Walsh called was Carol. She walked to the witness stand like she was walking to her own execution. But once she started testifying, the performance began. Tears at exactly the right moments. A trembling voice when she described their financial hardship, a mother's concern for her son's future. "Wade promised us $104,000 for the down payment," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "We trusted him. We built our entire future around his word." "And what happened when you asked him to fulfill that promise?" Walsh prompted. "He became violent," Carol said, her voice breaking. "He threw wine on our carpet, destroyed our property, and screamed at us in front of our friends. It was terrifying." When Susan cross-examined her, the facade began to crack. "Mrs. Patterson, you testified that my client promised you $104,000. Was this promise made in writing?" "No, it was a family conversation." "And this conversation took place at a barbecue on July 4th, 2022? "Yes." "According to your testimony," my client said, and I quote, "I will give you $104,000 for a house down payment." Those were his exact words? Carol hesitated. "Well, not those exact words, but that was the meaning." Susan pulled out a document. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm showing you a bankruptcy filing from Knox County, Tennessee, dated March 15th, 2020. Is this your signature?" The color drained from Carol's face. Circumstances were different then." "You filed for bankruptcy under your maiden name, Carol Brennan, listing $87,000 in unsecured debt. Is that correct?" "Yes, but—" "And you didn't disclose this bankruptcy when you applied for the mortgage on the house in question?" Walsh jumped up. "Objection. Relevance?" "Goes to credibility, Your Honor," Susan replied calmly. "Overruled. Answer the question." Carol's voice was barely a whisper. "No, I didn't disclose it." When Preston took the stand, he tried to project confidence, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Walsh walked him through the same sob story. The promise, the reliance, the cruel betrayal. "My father looked me in the eye and told me he would help us buy a house," Preston said. "I trusted him. He's my dad." When Susan stood for cross-examination, she was holding a different folder, one I recognized from our preparation sessions. "Mr. Patterson, you testified that you relied on your father's promise to your detriment, is that correct?" "Yes." "You made financial decisions based on this alleged promise?" "Yes." Susan walked to the evidence table and retrieved a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit A into evidence." She handed the paper to Preston, and I watched his face go white as he recognized what it was. "Mr. Patterson, please tell the court what document you're holding." Preston's hands were shaking. It's a gift letter." "And what is a gift letter used for?" It certifies that money has been transferred for a mortgage down payment." Susan's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. This document, dated 3 weeks before your alleged conversation with my client, states that the $104,000 has already been transferred to your account. It's signed by Wade Patterson. She turned to face the jury. But here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. My client was in Atlanta, Georgia, attending a trade conference on the date this document was allegedly signed. We have hotel receipts, plane tickets, and conference registration to prove it. Susan turned back to Preston. So, Mr. Patterson, if your father was in Atlanta, who signed this document? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Preston looked at his lawyer, at his wife, at me. I could see him calculating, trying to find a way out of the trap, but there wasn't one. I signed it, he whispered. You forged your father's signature? Yes. On a document submitted to a federally insured bank? Yes. To secure a $15,000 mortgage loan? Preston put his head in his hands. Yes. Susan turned to Judge Crawford. Your Honor, the defendant moves for immediate dismissal of all civil claims. The plaintiff has just admitted to bank fraud and perjury under oath. Judge Crawford's face was granite. He looked at Preston like he was something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. Mr. Patterson, the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, did you forge your father's signature on a federal banking document? Yes, sir, Preston said, barely audible. Bailiff, take Mr. Preston Patterson and Mrs. Carol Patterson into custody for perjury and contempt of court. I'm referring this entire matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for federal prosecution. The bailiffs moved quickly. Preston looked at me as they cuffed him, his eyes pleading for mercy that I no longer had to give. Dad, he said as they led him away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I watched my son being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. Justice finally was being served. The lawsuit was dismissed. Preston and Carol were facing federal charges, and I was free to live the rest of my life without their manipulation. But the best part was still to come. The silence in my house that evening was different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't the heavy quiet of grief or anger or uncertainty. It was the peaceful silence of a man who had fought a war and won, who had stood up for his principles and seen justice served. I sat in my recliner with a glass of Maker's Mark, looking at the newspaper clipping Susan had given me. Local couple arrested on federal fraud charges, the headline read. The article was brief but accurate. It described the courtroom confession, the forged documents, the identity theft scheme. Preston and Carol were facing 5 to 10 years in federal prison. My phone had been ringing all day. Reporters wanting comments, old Navy buddies who'd seen the news, neighbors offering support. I'd let them all go to voicemail. There would be time for explanations later. Tonight I just wanted to sit in my own house, in my own chair, and process what I'd been through. The next morning I drove to Susan's office for our final meeting. There were loose ends to tie up, the civil judgment against Preston and Carol for my legal fees, the restitution for the fraudulent credit card charges, the paperwork to make everything official. How do you feel? Susan asked as we reviewed the settlement documents. Free, I said, and meant it. For the first time in months, I feel free. What's next for you? I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. At 62, I had maybe 20 good years left, and I'd spent too many of them worrying about people who didn't deserve my concern. I'm selling the house, I told her. Going to buy an RV and see the country I served? Susan smiled. That sounds like a perfect retirement plan. What about Lance? That was the hard part. My grandson was 8 years old and his parents were going to prison. He was going to need stability, guidance, and financial security. All the things Preston and Carol had never provided. I'm setting up a trust fund, I said. Susan, I want you to establish the Lance Patterson Educational Trust. Put $400,000 in it, managed by the bank until he turns 25. College tuition, books, reasonable living expenses, but not a dime goes to his parents. Susan made notes on her legal pad. What if Preston and Carol try to access it? Poison pill clause, I said. If they attempt to touch the money or petition for control, the entire balance gets donated to the Louisville Metro Police Benevolent Fund. That's brilliant, Susan said. What about guardianship of Lance? My sister Diane has agreed to take him. She's got a good marriage, stable income, and she knows how to say no when kids ask for things they haven't earned. Susan completed the paperwork while I signed, document after document, trust agreements, power of attorney forms, instructions for the trustee bank. By the time we finished, Lance's future was secured in a way his parents could never touch or destroy. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign went up in my front yard. The house sold within 3 days to a young couple expecting their first child. They looked at my updated electrical work and quality craftsmanship with the same appreciation I'd felt when I bought the place 30 years ago. I took only what I needed: clothes, tools, photo albums, and my Navy memorabilia. Everything else, furniture, kitchen appliances, lawn equipment, went with the house. I was starting over at 62, and I'd never felt more optimistic about the future. The RV I bought was a 35-foot Winnebago with every modern convenience: full kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, satellite TV, and solar panels. It was like a luxury apartment on wheels, capable of taking me anywhere the road led. On my last day in Louisville, I drove to Diane's house to say goodbye to Lance. She'd enrolled him in a new school, found him a counselor to help process his parents' situation, and was already teaching him the difference between needs and wants. "Grandpa!" Lance yelled when he saw me, running across the yard to give me a hug. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling down to his level. "How are you doing?" "Aunt Diane says Mom and Dad made some bad choices and have to go away for a while," he said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that kids sometimes show for adult disasters. "But she also says I'm going to be okay." "You are going to be okay," I promised him. "Better than okay. You're going to be great." I handed him a small wrapped package. Inside was the brass Navy compass I'd been saving for his birthday. "This belonged to your great-grandfather," I told him. "He gave it to me when I joined the Navy, and now I'm giving it to you. It always points north, no matter where you are or how lost you feel." Lance turned the compass over in his small hands, watching the needle settle on magnetic north. "Will I see you again, Grandpa?" "When you turn 18, I'll find you," I promised. "We'll go fishing, and I'll tell you stories about your great-grandfather in the Navy and what it means to be a man of honor." I hugged him tight, smelling the shampoo in his hair and feeling his small arms around my neck. Then I stood up, shook hands with Diane, and walked back to my truck without looking back. The next morning, I pointed the Winnebago west on I-264 and drove out of Louisville for the last time. The sun was shining, the sky was endless, and every mile took me farther from the pain and closer to whatever adventure awaited. 3 months later, I was parked in a campground outside Yellowstone National Park, sharing coffee and war stories with a group of fellow veterans. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Patterson, this is Detective Morrison with Louisville Metro Police. Thought you'd want to know. Preston and Carol both pled guilty today. He got 6 years federal, she got 4. Case closed." I deleted the message and looked out at the mountains surrounding the campground. Somewhere back in Kentucky, Lance was learning algebra and playing Little League and discovering that the world was bigger than his parents' mistakes. In a few years, he'd start getting statements from his trust fund, watching it grow, understanding that someone had cared enough to secure his future. I poured myself another cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over the Grand Tetons. I was 62 years old, alone, and completely free. The road stretched ahead like a promise, and for the first time in decades, I had nowhere to be but exactly where I was. We spend our lives building safety nets for our children, hoping they'll never fall. But sometimes that net becomes a hammock for their entitlement. True love isn't about funding a lifestyle they haven't earned. It's about having the courage to let them face the consequences of their choices. By cutting the cord, I hadn't just saved my retirement. I'd reclaimed my dignity, secured my grandson's future, and learned that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is say no and mean it. The mountains didn't care about family drama or lawsuits or broken promises. They just stood there, ancient and permanent, reminding me that some things endure no matter what storms pass through. I was finally home,